I believe we have an international audience today. I'm joining you from Barcelona. Not to upset anybody, but about 1 hour ago, I was on the beach with my wife and son. There's some good surf there today. We were enjoying the early morning. And I came up here to meet all of you. And while we were on the beach, interestingly, we were listening to the festival so far. So I managed to catch Reto. I caught the tail end of Rob earlier, jumped into a bit of Cecile, and also caught most of what you were showing, Patrick, just now as well. So I wanted to connect a little bit with the flavor of what was happening. And the reason for that is, you'll see I'm not sharing my screen today. I'm not having any slides. I decided that I would jump in here and go with stream of consciousness with an approximate enabling constraint around this question of why we created Sociocracy 3.0. And to give credit to the kind of origins of that. And in part, that's giving origins historically to people who came before us, but also to give credit to you and all of us here for the inherent wisdom that lies within our beings. So I'm not quite sure where the talk will go today. What I intend to do is go with this for about 25 minutes. If questions come up while I'm sharing, feel free already to add them to the chat. And then at around 1:30 or just after, depending on what's coming out of me in that moment, I'm going to take a pause and open up for questions from you. So I'd like to really dedicate some time, not just questions about S3, because I'm not going to talk so directly about S3 itself today. That's Sociocracy 3.0 for anybody who's missed the abbreviation. But also just your questions about organization in general, and maybe questions that are connected to what motivated you to come here today. So on that note, maybe before I start, I would love to hear from a few of you. If you were to summarize what motivated you to join this conference today in no more than 3 words, what would you say? And if you have access to the chat, I'd invite you just to put those words into the chat right now. What motivated you in your short, precious lifetime to commit this time today to be here now in this festival? Why would you do that? And I just want to give a moment for you to find the answer to that question and jot some answers down. And meanwhile, while you're doing that, here we go. We have some answers already. So Lucas, learning and inspiration. I see some others coming. I wanted to pick up on Patrick's closing words, because they're also very dear to me. He was saying that for him, what's most important is to acknowledge our responsibility as stewards, not only for ourselves and the future that we give birth to here, but also next generations, those that follow as well. And I see some of you are sharing. Reto's here to learn something new. Nicola, curiosity, learning opportunities and spreading horizons. Learning, leaning into the future for change. Frustration and curiosity. Frustration can be a great driver for change. It's usually a lack of willingness to tolerate the now as we perceive it. Seeing different approaches and so on. Yeah, so one thing's certain. We inherited the consequences of those that came before us, for better or worse. That included indoctrination into the societies and cultures in which we were born into. And more than we realize, we inherited the habitual behaviors of those that came before us. Sometimes through our evolution as human beings, we polarize with some of those behaviors and opt for the opposite, kind of vowing never to be like my parents, for example. But we tend to flip-flop, and to a large extent, we're influenced by the environment into which we're born. Just backing up to reasons why people are here, we've got seeing different approaches and hearing practical examples, connecting new dots. Joy and fun aspects are not excluded. Let's hope not, Nicola. Yeah, so we inherit the habits of those that came before us. And certainly those that follow will inherit our habits, yeah, or will at least be profoundly influenced by the consequence of our actions and inactions throughout our lifetimes. And that, for me, about 20 years ago, became a really pressing issue, because I was in a moment in my life where I was pursuing quite self-centric objectives. I was quite entrepreneurial. at the time. But I was confronted by the thought that what I did would be of consequence. And I took that idea and looked at what I was doing at the time. And in my opinion, at least, there was an enormous absence of meaning in what I was doing. I was living out the kind of expectations and the injunctions that I'd been subjected to throughout my early life, and was seeking to mold myself somehow in an image I had of how I should be. And this was in my mid-20s. I wouldn't say I was completely unconscious of the fact, but even though I railed against sometimes these inner injunctions, generally speaking, and I was still quite subservient to that patterning. And around that time, when I realized the absence of meaning, you could say purposefulness would be another way of looking at that in my life, I realized that I needed to make some major changes to what I was doing. And I had a conversation with Lucas a couple of weeks ago, and I recall, I think I touched into this topic of my work with young people for a decade, kids who were at risk of social exclusion. I started as a volunteer working with these kids, and then very quickly that evolved into a career for 10 years. And many things fascinated me about working with these young people. I learned more than I could ever imagined I would, not only about them and about that area of work, but also about myself. But something that really struck me was that the main approach we used with these kids was to invite them to reflect on what was meaningful for them and to create environments where they could explore that and pursue that in some way. And what I saw for a lot of the kids that we were engaging at the time was just this enormous frustration they felt, because the environments they were being born into, the cultural norms, the familial norms, the social norms, were somehow not working for them. And these kids were frustrated. Sometimes they were also extremely hurt and coming from very abusive environments. But generally speaking, they were standing up and saying, hey, this doesn't work. There's a problem. We need a different way of doing things, or we need to be in an environment that is different to enable us to flourish and grow. And this helped me to understand that there are, from a binary, simplistic point of view, there's a couple of ways of viewing child development. One is that the child is empty, and we need to teach children all of the things that they need to know in order to be a successful human being. This was very much the ideology that I was indoctrinated into as a child. And then the other side was that children are by no means empty and full of innate potential that can blossom in numerous ways. And if you focus on creating the right environment for those children to blossom, then they will quite naturally grow into adult human beings with integrity and sense of purposefulness and willingness to take responsibility and so on. And I'm still processing those insights that I got 20 years ago in that work with young people, but I think that there's an enormous overlap with what we're seeing emergent in organizations today. One of the big challenges that young people have, children and young people, is that if they don't conform to a point, then they face some kind of social exclusion. And we all need to adapt ourselves somehow to meet the social expectations into which we're born. But when you arrive at the point where the individual is compromised so much through needing to adapt and try and stay within the bounds of what's acceptable and normal, then you start to see the unhealthy consequences of that in that individual. And a lot of my work was with schools and helping schools to broaden their perspective around what a human being was and take a more holistic view on the learning needs and the educational needs of children and young people. And I think this is very much what we're seeing in organizations today as well. We're coming from a long lineage and a long evolutionary path of human organizing, and we're arriving into a situation in these times where we're recognizing increasingly, consciously, the enormous complexity of life. And as we recognize that and learn to interact with it in different ways, we create more complexity. And we're kind of in this self-perpetuating exponential explosion of complexity that we need to navigate somehow. And there are limitations to the habitual ways that we've learned to orientate and navigate in this kind of environment. So reflecting back this morning on what Rob was sharing, and Cecile and Reto and Patrick, and what brings many of you here today as well, I think behind all of this is a pretty common need. We need to find ways to be able to individually and together navigate the complexity that we're experiencing in a manner that's at least good enough to meet our needs. And part of our needs as human beings, when those basic needs are met, is to realize ourselves and to evolve and develop to become more than somehow. And so this is really this is a calling right now for individuals and organizations to find ways to accommodate this more. Some of you might have caught Reto's talk this morning. So he was endeavoring to introduce S3 in an hour. That's no easy task. I've been trying to do that for 5-6 years now, and there's no easy way of doing it, partly because it's not really possible to introduce S3 in an hour of time. Reto gave some examples, and he was especially pointing towards decision making. But if we look at S3 from a broader perspective, it's not just about making and evolving agreements together. It's about patterns of behavior that have emerged through our ancestors' endeavors to navigate complexity and respond to the various challenges and opportunities they face. And these behaviors prevailed in some way because of their usefulness in certain situations. So let me just say something briefly about that for those of you who missed it, or to offer you a slightly different perspective on where Reto was coming from. S3 really is just a menu of human behavior patterns. And the patterns were there long before S3 was. You can build frameworks like Holacracy or Scrum or the Sociocratic Circle method out of S3 patterns. So one way to think of it is a kind of breakdown of specific processes and guidelines that people follow in organizational contexts to be able to deal with those situations that emerge in whatever unique context they're facing. And Reto also mentioned that when I met Bernard Bockelbrink for the first time, I was a strong advocate at that time of the Sociocratic Circle method. And it didn't take long for Bernard to dismantle my faith in the Sociocratic Circle method as being a viable way to proceed, not because there's not enormous utility in it, but because of the limitations of any methodology in the face of complexity across a spectrum of different contexts. So the way I came to realize that, Bernard asked me one day if I could give examples of organizations that over time had prevailed with their application of the Sociocratic Circle method. And I had to concede that in my experience, at least, and I know there are some, but in my experience, I didn't know any organization that had stuck to the Sociocratic Circle method by the book. And he asked me, well, what did they do then? And actually what they did is they adapted things according to their context. They kept things they thought worked, they discarded what they thought didn't, or they adapted those things. For better or worse, that's not to say it was always a positive decision, but that's just what people did. This was really how S3 was born, because we realized that there was utility in so many different ways that people are doing things. In fact, you could argue that at the heart of every behavior, no matter how different it is to others, there's something of value that in a certain context is going to be relevant and useful. And when I first came across the Sociocratic Circle method in 2001, that's what really struck me more than anything else. It was the fact that a group of people could come together and through mutual intent could agree to bring the fullness of what it was that they were perceiving, what it was that they thought was valuable, the ideas and the experience they had, and to offer that into a circle of people, and to agree to also do their best to hear and receive what other people were sharing as well. And rather than flip-flopping around in a kind of binary world with a fight to see who's right or wrong, not to discount rightness and wrongness in certain contexts, but it was more about looking for the essential value in the different perspectives and weaving them together to allow a more conscious understanding, a more rich, broad, deep grasp of the circumstances that were being faced, and a more creative pool to draw from in terms of looking at how to proceed somehow. And this segues a lot back to my work with young people, because I was working with groups of young people, and part of what was so enriching about those group experiences was that these kids were so different. They had common needs, but they had enormously different backgrounds, and they had enormously different backgrounds to me as well. And simply by coming together and creating that space where we would share together and hear from one another, it enabled us all to begin to broaden our perspective somehow, to see things in a more high resolution or a more granular way. And this leads to a phrase that I wanted to share with you today. It's a phrase that I found myself uttering increasingly over the last year or so when I'm talking about S3, because very often people will want to know what's Sociocracy 3.0. And as I said, that's a difficult question to answer. But this phrase for me is a hold-all. It really captures something that transcends not just S3, but all of the methodologies, the frameworks, the different ways that are being documented and shared in the world today around how we approach cooperation and collaboration in organizations. And that phrase is at the interface between the habitual and the new, potential for greater consciousness resides. At the interface between the habitual and the new, potential for greater consciousness resides. Now, why that's relevant, first of all, in the case of S3 is my business these days is passing on these behavior patterns to people. But as human beings, we have a tendency, quite unconsciously often, to look outside of ourselves for the answer. So if I present a pattern from S3 to somebody, then they're going to value that somehow from their own perspective. If they don't see any relevance to that pattern, then they might just not pay attention to start with. Or if they stand in a position where they perceive that pattern to somehow compromise something that they value as being important, then they might polarize with it. And if they find resonance with it somehow, and they project values onto that pattern that are resonant with their own, then they might very well kind of lean towards that. And so what I started to realize sharing about S3 was that as people come into relationship with it, they're considering these patterns from their own perspective somehow. And at that interface, they have the potential for a few things. One is to understand something about that particular pattern and how it could be applied in different organizational contexts. But another one was to become more conscious of what might previously have been a more unconscious habitual behavior in themselves. So we tend to look outside of ourselves for the answer when we want something. And when we're threatened by something, we tend to fall back unconsciously onto ourselves for some habitual way of responding to that situation. So when I was working with these kids, what was most important in order to be able to build any kind of relationship with them at all was for them to get a sense that they mattered to me, and for them to get a sense that what was important to them mattered to me. And the work that we did wasn't trying to inflict on these kids things that we thought they should know about and that they should learn or reflect on, but rather to identify areas of need they had and then to help them discover ways that they could respond to those needs that they had in perhaps a more sophisticated or more effective way than they'd habitually learned to do. And it always started with need. It started with acknowledgement of that young person that something about their current experience was inadequate for them, that their perception of what was happening revealed something that was different to what they expected or wished to see. And they were at a moment in their lives where they were willing to acknowledge the limitations of their current way of doing things and to look outside of themselves for something that might enrich their approach in some way. And so this was an enormous realization as I was diving deeper into S3, was the importance of starting with need And Reto, in his presentation, spoke about this importance too. You start where you are. The other thing was that these kids quite often endured opinions that their behavior was wrong. And you remember I was saying earlier that my revelation was at the heart of every behavior, there's something of value. It's contextual when that might be relevant. And I discovered that these young people responded much more effectively if I could acknowledge the essential value in different behaviors. And those behaviors might include aggression, might include disrespect, might include non-participation, engagement, crime, whatever it might be. And I don't think it's so different today in organizations as well. So there's a lot of talk during this festival and in the myriad of other online festivals and conferences that are coming up right now around the topic of organizational development, around how you transform organizations. And for me, transformation is relevant in a moment when there's the necessity to transform something. But the other thing that's just fundamentally important to recognize is the enormous wisdom that we can see reflected in the existing structures, the existing behaviors, the existing approaches that you can see woven into the fabric of organizations today. So much like acknowledging in these young people all that they'd learned to be able to navigate life and get to the point that they had in a reasonably kind of together way, so too I realized through my journey with S3 that it's very important also to look at the historical origins behind the behaviors you see in organizations, especially those organizations that have been around for a longer period of time, and be very wary of throwing out the baby with the bathwater when it comes to initiating some kind of change. So coming back to this phrase, at the interface between the habitual and the new, the potential for greater consciousness resides. I feel very humble with S3 these days. I heard somebody say recently they thought S3 kind of covered all of the necessary areas that an organization needs to develop. I don't think that's true at all, actually. I think that S3 provides some patterns that can help you develop your own patterns to be able to navigate the complexity that you face depending on the context. But I'm less inclined to tell people that they need patterns from S3 and more inclined these days to suggest to people that they pay attention to their environment. They check with one another around what they're perceiving, and they look out for moments when their habitual ways of doing things are failing to bring about the results that they would expect or wish to see. And maybe even prioritize areas of need as they perceive them, and start somewhere with small changes where they can try something new and see whether or not that yields some kind of better result than the one that they were getting before. And regardless of whether you get a better result or not, the main point is to learn from the experience. And if you are able to set these experiments up in safe to fail ways, then you create the opportunity for yourself to be able to extract learning from whatever it is that happens and apply that into how you iteratively and incrementally evolve what you do next. So, those of you familiar with Agile probably see the overlap there. This idea of iterative and incremental development, not only of products and services, but also of the decisions we make that guide how we proceed individually and together in organizations. I don't want to go into that in too much detail today, but I do want to acknowledge it. But what I would like to touch on before I open up for questions is I'd like to say something more about habitual behavior. And I'd like to say something about why I think it's so important that we acknowledge it and that we make it conscious. And in the case of organizations, there's often collusion to deny behaviors that are expressing somehow in the organizational system. There's often collusion to pretend that the organization that exists is different to the one that actually exists. I mean, in terms of how power is distributed, in terms of who really has influence over who, in terms of where the social relationships are, and so on. But it can be really uncomfortable to look at human behavior and recognize inadequacies in our ability to manage ourselves and in our ability to manage together somehow. And I feel an enormous empathy for us as human beings. Because going back to those kids I was talking about, they were deeply identified with some of the behaviors that were leading them to experience extreme social exclusion. And certainly for many of them, they needed to make changes to some of those behaviors because it was just inappropriate to the context. But it was only by acknowledging the vulnerability that that behavior was serving somehow that those kids, and helping them to recognize the vulnerability, helping them to recognize those consequences that they would prefer to avoid that resulted from those behaviors, that they were able to find the resolve and the discipline to be able to step out somewhat from those habitual ways of doing things and consider something new. And this is really relevant to me as somebody working with people in organizations today. A really important insight to keep in mind, because it's easy to go into any organizational context with my opinions about what would be more or less appropriate and helpful. And it's easy for me to form opinions about what does and doesn't serve within the organization. But the fact is that every one of us, through our own perspective, has the same certainty and the same resolve. And as human beings, some of us have learned very different and sometimes quite polarized ways of facing life and of meeting the challenges that we face. And if I can elevate myself enough outside of my own point of view and recognize the integrity in somebody else's belief that their approach or what they're standing for is important, then it helps me to disidentify somewhat from my own position, to embrace other options, and not necessarily in the end to agree with those opinions, but rather to have this higher resolution, more triune perspective of what's happening, which enriches my capacity to be able to contribute effectively to the whole. And the last thing I want to say was this, that going back to those kids again, and if you haven't figured it out by now, working with these kids had a pretty big influence in my understanding of sociocracy in general and S3 in particular. With freedom comes responsibility. I think Patrick spoke a lot to this, talking about in Holacracy, it's a misconception to imagine that if you take all the walls down, everything's going to turn out fine. We need constraints somehow. We need some kind of guidelines for how we approach things. And with these young people, at the start of my work with them over many weeks or months, I used to invite them to join me in developing the constraints together. We made group guidelines that were meaningful to them and that were relevant to them in the context of what we were doing together. Further, they agreed and decided to join those programs with me to begin with. So there was some volition and choice. So I'm saying this because sociocracy in its origins was about a form of government. It was about a way of Auguste Comte's anticipation that in the future as human beings we would need to find ways to govern ourselves that were more reasonable, were more evidence-based, and were more participatory, as a move away from a more feudal fundamentalist approach to rule, where you had power concentrated in a few and that power was used to rule others. And so coming forward to the idea of sociocracy in the modern day organization, sociocracy is about rule by the social group. It's about distributing power to influence according to need in the system, not about getting rid of hierarchy, not about removing leaders or management, but about having fit for purpose, good enough decisions that help people to achieve shared objectives somehow in the organization. And with this freedom comes responsibility. And so the importance of being clear on how we distribute power in the organization, being clear on the responsibilities that each of us has as individuals and what we the responsibilities we have of groups of people, as teams of people throughout organizations, is crucial and actually necessary for our sense of safety and well-being, so that we can relax into the area of responsibility that we have and bring our very best to that environment somehow. The last thing I'd like to say before I open up to questions, and I'd really welcome any questions you have. I don't see any right now, so please do feel free, unless you want me just to freestyle for another 25 minutes, which I could also do, was to quote Rumi. Rumi is such an awesome writer and philosopher and thinker. And there's one phrase that I've carried with me for many years. Beyond right and wrongdoing, there's a field, I'll meet you there. Maybe that's familiar for some of you. Beyond right and wrongdoing, there's a field, I'll meet you there. I don't think we're smart enough to navigate complexity alone. I think this is precisely why out of our early communities evolved organization in our need to coordinate and our need to harness distributed intelligence to be able to deal with the complexities of life and the challenges we face. And I think today more than ever, we are confronted by the realization of our limitations as individuals. We're awesome and we're incredible and we're so full of experience and wisdom, but we need each other. And perhaps now, globally, we're arriving in a moment when we need to move beyond the remnants of feudal rule systems. Not to move away from leadership, not to move away from delegation of influence to people over other people when there's reason for that to happen. We need a more sophisticated and more mature perspective on that. But we need to distribute power to influence through the system in ways that's meaningful for people, in ways where people can recognize the value in putting in the effort and time required to learn something, to unlearn something, to disidentify from their habitual ways of doing things, and to consider something new. And this is no quick fix. This is a long game that I believe will extend over many generations. But to come back to Patrick's closing phrase before, we're stewards of our own and the next generation's future. You know, for sure, those that follow will inherit the consequence of our actions and inactions as surely as we inherited the consequence of the actions and inactions of those that came before us. And this, at this time, more than ever, I think, is something we need to learn to do together. And learning to do it together is an initiative that begins one person at a time. So, I'm going to hit pause. I would like to invite you to reach in and see whether there are any questions or even reflections that you would enjoy to share. And let's just take a minute or so of silence, and I welcome you to add some things to the chat. Okay, well, I made Nicola speechless. Let's see, Patrick here. Patrick, I'm very curious to hear more about how you think about navigating the interface between the habitual and the new. In my experience, if the gap between the habitual and the new is too subtle, it's hard to pick up on. If the gap is too large, it's overwhelming. It's the whole thing about the frog in the pot of boiling water. I would completely agree with that, Patrick. And we can zoom into a very high resolution here and appreciate the fact that there's an enormous amount from what's happening around us that we miss most of the time. I'm no expert on this, but I just remember numbers sometimes. I remember a statistic that in the Western world, at least, we tend to perceive about 5% of what's happening in our environment. And I'm not quite sure the metrics considered in that. Interestingly, in Asia, and I think it was the Chinese especially, tended to see about 10% because they were more visual than us. But anyway, the point is that there's a whole bunch of things that are happening around us all the time that we can miss. And equally, when we perceive something that seems so different to what we're familiar with, then we tend to be repelled by that unless there's some extreme reason why that might have utility for us. In S3, we described a pattern called navigate via tension. Navigate via tension is basically, so for those familiar with holacracy, let's acknowledge tension in holacracy overlaps, but is used slightly differently to how we use tension in S3. When we talk about tension in S3, we're talking about that inner state of alarm or alert when we perceive something that's different to what we expect or wish to see. So just because I perceive something that appears to be different to what I expect or wish to see, one, doesn't mean to say that I'm going to become conscious of it, and two, doesn't mean to say that what I'm perceiving is an accurate interpretation of what it is that I see. But the one thing that is certain is that when there's a dissonance between expectations and perception, we experience some kind of inner alarm, and in moments, it's possible that we can be alerted to that alarm if we're paying attention. And by doing so, it gives us the opportunity to go behind our attention and ask ourselves the question, what is it I'm perceiving that's different to what I expect or wish to see? Okay, so in terms of navigating via tension, we're inviting people to pay attention to tension they experience in their system and to look behind that, to ask themselves, what is it that I'm perceiving? Is that relevant in the case of the organization or not? Does it represent some kind of challenge or potential problem? Does it represent some kind of opportunity that were I to interact with it could bring about a better tomorrow than the one that I perceive today? And secondly, because we're not smart enough to navigate complexity alone, it's also useful to talk to our friends and colleagues about that as well. So by navigating via tension and then describing what we're perceiving, and maybe assumptions we have around what might be needed and why it's relevant and so on, and what outcomes might come about through interacting with those situations, we can also get feedback from others. We can synergize perspectives, synergize wisdom in different ways to more likely clarify what it is that we're actually perceiving and if it's relevant, and also to more effectively harness ideas about how to respond to that situation. Okay, so that's one aspect of the interface between the habitual and the new. We need to notice that we're seeing something new in order to be able to interact with it. But the other side of the question, I think, Patrick, is around more the point I was making in terms of the patterns from S3. So how do people perceive patterns when they come across them? And are there certain circumstances where someone perceives a particular pattern and the gap's just too big, it's too far away from them? I would say absolutely so. And on the other hand, how often is it that people would interpret a pattern through their own habitual lens and then miss the deeper layers of what the implications of that pattern and how it might be relevant? You can't avoid that. And so I find the most helpful thing is to make it explicit, to be humble, to acknowledge the limitations of our perspectives, to speak with others, to learn together, to be open to put aside our own ideas so that we can see things through the eyes of others as well, and recognize that there are just limitations to what we can achieve. So thanks for the question, Patrick. Kathleen, I'm wondering what you see with regard to the implementation of new structures of governance, and yet somehow habitual power structures still flowing through this beautiful system untouched. What else beyond the structures is necessary as an organization for the new structures to become fully embodied? Well, that's a good question. Let me take one angle on this. So when I think about organizations and how power flows through them, there's three different perspectives we can have on the organization. One, as I referenced earlier, would be the organization as we pretend exists. So there might be elements of truthfulness in that, and there might be elements of deception, both individual and group collusion somehow. But every organizational system will have power distributed, power to influence distributed through that system in certain ways. And the consequences of that will be beneficial in some cases and problematic in others. So one thing you can do is be as explicit and transparent as you can. When I say transparent, I mean so people know about it, about where the strengths are in the organization, what the value is that the current system brings, and where the areas of need are. Where, despite that structure, despite that distribution of power, are you seeing results that are different to what you would expect or wish to see? Right? So that's one thing. But the other thing is about being transparent about the distribution of power itself. So in S3, we have a concept called domain. You see the concept domain in the Sociocratic circle method. It's used slightly differently in Holacracy. Once again, there's some overlap, but a distinction as well. When we refer to domain, you could, I think, in my amateur understanding of Holacracy, tie that approximately with the idea of a role. It's like an area of work or an area of responsibility. And so domains in S3 are distinct areas of influence, activity, and decision-making in organizations. Now, the organization we pretend exists, right, might more or less accurately reflect the organization that does exist in terms of how the organization is divided into domains and how power to influence is distributed through the organization for people to use their time, energy, and the limited resources available to respond to those domains. So making domains conscious, making it clear and explicit who is responsible for what in the organization helps to bring into consciousness the manner in which and the specificity in which people in the organization, individually and together, have so far structured that organizational system. And one of my biggest anxieties about reorganization is, when I say reorganization, like whole system reorganization, is what about all the value that's woven into how things are right now? And very often you see people see the problems in the system, some of them, but they're much less likely to see the value in those systems. And when you go in and throw the whole thing out and start something new, you create a myriad of new problems. So coming back to this question, Catalin, of what else beyond the structure is necessary as an organization for the new structure to become fully embodied, the changes you make need to be relevant and meaningful to the people who are making them and or the people who are impacted by those changes. So being clear on why things are happening, being clear on the problems, being clear on the opportunities, being clear on how things currently are, and recognizing the value in what's there, and then identifying more specifically where the problem points are and when it might be valuable to make changes to the organizational structure itself. All of these things in place help people to have a much more relaxed time. Yeah. And Patrick just jumped in here to say in Holacracy, it's pretty close to the definition you just gave for S3. Domains are like a piece of property controlled exclusively by a role or circle. And that's the difference, actually, Patrick, because in S3, we say a domain is it's an area of influence, activity, and decision-making, but it's not necessarily a piece of property controlled exclusively by a role or circle. Okay, so let me give an example. I might be part of a team, and the team was created by somebody as a way for them to take care of a responsibility that they had. Or it was created by another team as a way to take care of a responsibility they had. And they delegated influence for that to me and to the team. And so I have power within that domain to make and evolve agreements, to utilize certain resources that are made available to me in the absence of objection from the delegator, and also in the absence of objection from anybody else. So I'm subservient, and my team is subservient to the collective intelligence of the people around. So I think there's a big similarity, and we're very much focusing in S3 on enabling people to create value as freely as possible for themselves. And clarifying domains helps people understand the area that they are responsible for and why and where and what they have available to create value. But the domain itself is not the ownership of the team. The domain is something the team are stewards for, but they still answer to the delegator, whoever kind of created that team to start with and contracted to them to take responsibility for it. And let me share something else on this. Something that excites me so much about domains is that in a traditional management hierarchy, you would have someone in a management role who, one, often takes responsibility for governance of the people that can answer to them. And we know in Holacracy and we know in the Sociocratic circle method that there's a move from the managed team to the circle of stakeholders who contribute towards making and evolving agreements together. But the other thing is that, in a management hierarchy, the manager somehow carries authority. And I'm not opposed to somebody carrying authority. I think it's absolutely essential in an organization. Different people have authority, and sometimes they have authority that will influence others. But I think a big problem we've faced as human beings is our tendency to feel some resistance or some sense of coercion when somebody carries authority over us. And so circles are kind of cool concept because they're shifting decision-making to a group of people to make and evolve those agreements together, which can include a manager. But the thing about clarifying domains is you can start to build the wisdom that lies behind the authority of a management structure into the fabric of the domains themselves. So what I mean by that is, if I am a delegator and you answer to me, and I create a domain and I ask you to take responsibility for that domain, and you take responsibility for it, we can work together on evolving the constraints of the domain in a manner that enables you to maximally create value in a way that's coherent with the more kind of high-level, broader responsibilities that I have as a delegator. So we're shifting authority from a person into the structure itself. But to do that, you need to be clear on what the structure is. And for me, this is what excites me a lot about clarifying domains. How does that play out in your organizational context? Well, for example, if you're in an organization, maybe you have a role or more than one. Maybe you're part of a team or more than one. What would you describe as your area of responsibility? What's the reason why your role or team exists? What are the key responsibilities that you absolutely must take care of? What are the constraints within which you operate? What are the resources that you have available? What are the skills, qualities, and experience that you bring? And can you document that so that future people can recognize and appreciate the wisdom and experience that you have in relation to that domain? And asking people around you, hey, this is what I think I'm responsible for, but what do you think? Does it look like this to you? Am I missing something? Did you have a different idea about what I'm responsible for? So very quickly, we can start to make conscious what previously might just have been implicit. And am I in a hierarchical structure somehow? Quite likely in many cases. So I can also take that domain to my delegator, whomever that might be, individual or team, and ask them to take a look too. And it's amazing because so often on that delegator-delegatee relationship, there's an enormous disparity between what the delegator believes that individual or team are responsible for and what they are responsible for. And sometimes too, there's misunderstandings on the part of the individual or the team. So having that conversation, now we're confronted by this interface between the habitual, what we know, or the unconscious, and what the other expected, and we have that conversation, and through doing so, we make more conscious the areas of responsibility that exist in the organization and who is responsible for what, and we can start to evolve those domains consciously together so that they enable us to put in place constraints and distribute resources and limited time and energy in a manner that's continuously improving to help us continually improve how we deal with the various challenges and opportunities that we face. So, yeah, that's what I would say about domains for now. So, any other questions or reflections? We've got about 5 minutes. So Patrick was enjoying the exploration of the domain concept and thinking it's very close conceptually, S3 and holacracy. I totally agree, Patrick. I totally agree. I think there's enormous similarities, and that brings me back to reiterate what I was trying to communicate at the start, that the patterns from S3 were there long before S3 was. If you look at our ancestors, you can see that certain ways of organizing have emerged, certain ways of dealing with specific situations have emerged over time, and they've evolved and they've prevailed because of their relevance in certain contexts. And so in S3, we don't make any claim to having created anything particular. It's much more our endeavor to describe and champion somehow certain behavioral approaches that we see emergent in different methods and frameworks out there in the world and in human practice in organizations, in a manner where when anybody bumps up against a situation where their current ways of doing things are inadequate to bring about those results they expect or wish to see, then they can look to S3 as one set of options for alternatives that they might consider. Okay. So, any last questions, folks? I'll just wait a moment for that. Okay, so meanwhile, I think there's a way to close for me. Standing here now, I feel deep appreciation for the opportunities I've had that led me to a situation where I would meet Bernard Bockelbrink and Liliana David, and that the three of us would be on this journey together, developing S3. And at the same time, I just feel continually humbled. I'm not an academic. I came from a background without enormous education. I just had an epiphany at some point in my mid-20s where I realized that I needed to be invested in something more meaningful, and decided to listen out for invitations that came my way to see where it is I might be able to contribute something more valuable into the world. And I kind of stand humbled, actually, by the extraordinary, I mean, being alive is just ridiculously, unimaginably crazy, isn't it? It's like, if you really zoom out and you ask, what is this, and how did I come to be here, and how can I have an experience of you and you of me, and we be in this thing we call life, and so on. It's just so extraordinarily, unimaginably incredible, and yet so ordinary at the same time, that I can only kind of throw myself to the ground and bow in humility at the miracle of it all. And on the other hand, as part of that miracle, I'm able to perceive of our extraordinary potential to do better than we've done already, to improve so much how we interact with our environment, with one another, and with the world. And I think we stand on the precipice of a growingly conscious choice faced by the growing consequences of our actions and inactions in the world. And I, for one, feel that responsibility and ask the question, what is it that I can do to contribute somehow? And I feel afraid on some level, because I think we're at a moment where we need the responsibility of the individual, but we also need to learn how to cooperate and collaborate on far greater scale. And we need to do that in ways where more and more people are willing to take responsibility. And I wish that S3 patterns are a kind of stepping stone in that direction, but they're a means to an end, not an end in itself. And the end game, if anything, is greater consciousness, greater meaningfulness, greater engagement, willingness to take responsibility. And I very much hope that all of us can do our best to be a shining example, and that those that follow are born into a world where the habitual norms are slightly different to the ones that many of us were born into, and that we can keep the value of everything that came before and stay open and humble to the need for learning and growing something new into the future as well. So thank you so much for your time, and I wish you enjoy the rest of the festival.